Thanks, Mario, and thanks for having me, everybody. It's a real privilege to be here, and really nice to meet and talk to some of you, and hope we can talk a bit more later. Oh, I feel like an important person with a microphone. So do stop me, give me maybe a wave at five minutes before the end of the talk. So I'm going to talk about South Africa's minerals energy complex and the extent to which the country is or isn't undergoing an energy transition, and whether that transition is just or not, and also how just transition should even be defined. So there's four main bits to my talk. So the first is defining and explaining what's meant by South Africa's minerals energy complex. Second, to look more specifically at the country's electricity sector, which is really central to its minerals energy complex. And then to look at some of the developments that are ongoing within the energy sector, but also more broadly in society and the economy towards a just transition, and some of the kind of key tensions within that, and then to draw a few conclusions from it. So the talk that I'm giving today is based on a book chapter that I co-authored with somebody called Jessie Burton from the University of Cape Town. But it's also work that I've been doing for over a decade, and for more years than I care to remember. So it's kind of work that I've been building on for quite some years. So that's kind of what I've been drawing from, and I've spent quite a lot of time in the country. So just to describe what I mean by, or what's meant by the minerals energy complex. So in 1996, a professor from SOAS called Ben Fine and a South African academic called Zav Rustamji, they wrote a book called The Political Economy of South Africa, From Minerals Energy Complex to Industrialization. And what they meant by minerals energy complex was both a description of the country's system of accumulation, of its kind of economic growth paradigm, but it was also a political and economic analytical framework for how to think about changes taking place in the South African economy. And importantly, minerals energy complex isn't static, it's an evolving, like all systems of accumulation, it's evolving, it's changing over time. It often gets referred to as something that's very static when it isn't, and I'll talk through some of the ways in which it's changing as part of this talk. And it took its theoretical foundations from kind of the time in the mid-90s, so Marxist value theory and practice of developmental states and the military-industrial complex. So those were some of the theoretical origins it was coming from. And the historical core of the MEC, so it's an evolving system, but its historical core, which was developed under apartheid, was a capital-intensive, labor-intensive, energy-intensive, and carbon-intensive system, so involving cheap and abundant sources of coal for cheap electricity, which, coupled with cheap black labor under apartheid, were essential inputs into export-oriented mining and minerals processing. So in terms of mining, that was coal, gold, and platinum. In terms of minerals processing, it was iron, steel, also some non-ferrous metals, petrochemicals also. Central to this was the electricity sector, which was run by the state-owned utility called Eskom. And it wasn't just these sectors, but it was also the way in which they were linked. It was also the political and economic relationships between these sectors. So one of the things that this book did, and subsequent research since has done, was to analyse evolving relationships and linkages between highly concentrated ownership structures around the mining and minerals processing industries, but also state-owned enterprises, of which Eskom, the state-owned electricity, was one, and then corporate capital and finance. And these relationships involved an industrial policy elite, which had close connections with a political elite, and that included, for instance, the department responsible for mining, the department responsible for energy. And there was this dynamic of conflict and coordination, which still continues, even though the minerals energy complex has shifted and changed significantly. One of the things that I would argue is that the dynamic of conflict and coordination has continued. And also, very importantly, South Africa's minerals energy complex, it's obviously talking about developments within South Africa, but these are influenced and shaped by a global and historical context. So it's really important to keep that in mind as well. So the minerals energy complex has created one of the world's most socially unequal societies, based on political and racial marginalization under apartheid, and a lot of those, even though institutionally and legally that's changed in terms of the social structure, a lot of it has remained. It was also based very much on environmental injustice as well, which got talked about a lot less in the book, and that's probably because environmental injustice wasn't necessarily the focus of heterodox economists at the time. Unemployment we're now however many decades post-apartheid, it's still one of the most socially unequal countries. Unemployment is very high. And as well as social inequality, as well as one of the most socially unequal countries, it's also one of the most carbon-intensive economies. So South Africa is the world's 14th largest emitter of greenhouse gases. And at the centre of that carbon-intensive economy and at the centre of the MEC is the state-owned electricity utility called Eskom. And Eskom still today produces 45% of greenhouse gas emissions, and it's the world's most carbon-intensive electricity grid. So coal is a kind of central resource of the MEC is coal. Even though changes are afoot, it's still a central resource. It's responsible for 85% of electricity generation, 80% of national greenhouse gas emissions. It's benefited from significant state support and public subsidy over the years. And it's also a key employer, a source of export revenue as well. Another institution that I'm not going to say very much about today is Sasol, that you might have heard of. It's a petrochemicals multinational. So while Eskom is responsible for about 45% of emissions, Sasol is responsible for about 11%. So this graph kind of puts things in perspective with regards to the highly carbon-intensive or greenhouse gas-intensive nature of the economy. So as you can see there, electricity is a really important contributor to that. So any kind of transition that is taking place or may take place or is being planned and talked about has to involve the electricity sector because it plays such a significant role in greenhouse gas emissions. And then also coal, as you can see, coal, which is involved in manufacturing and coal to liquids technologies and transport, etc., is also a very significant part of that. So I've explained the kind of historical core of the minerals energy complex, but one thing's clear is that this historical core has been kind of fragmenting and shifting and unraveling for a number of decades. And partly this fragmentation is relational, so political and economic relationships between the state, private sector, trade unions. There's been, for instance, the offshoring of previous conglomerates, so Anglo-American, BHP Billiton, some key examples of that. And also there's been a shift away from mining and manufacturing. Mining and manufacturing still plays a role, but it's in decline. Its contribution to GDP is in decline, and finance now plays a much more significant role. So people are talking, including Ben Fine as the kind of one of the originators of the MEC, various people are talking about from minerals energy complex to minerals energy finance complex, and a sophisticated financial sector that takes place around the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, which is one of the biggest, the biggest stock exchange on the African continent. Also increased levels of national debt as well, the kind of important, really growing role for finance in the economy. Other changes taking place or other forms of fragmentation are endemic corruption in state-owned enterprises, with Eskom being one of those SOEs. Shifts in the electricity sector, including the introduction of renewable energy from independent power producers. And also national climate change commitments. So there's been a pledge to reach net zero by 2050. So that's going to have a huge impact on the power sector, given that so many emissions come from the power sector. So this fragmentation taking place within the MEC is still one of conflict and coordination, but with new networks and new alliances evolving around an emerging low-carbon regime, a declining mining sector, a growing finance sector. which brings me to the electricity sector. And I'm starting with the Enhanced Climate Ambition, which was launched in 21 at the Climate Change Conference in 2021. And I'm not going to say too much about it, except to say it's quite dramatic. And it's basically seeing a huge reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. And the way in which that has to be reached is, the implications for that is that the power sector, other sectors too, but the power sector will really need to decarbonise if that climate ambition is going to be reached. So that has, thus far, the plan is to decommission a lot of coal and to dramatically increase renewable energy, both at the large scale, the kind of utility scale, but also decentralised renewable electricity as well. The other thing to say, and this is kind of part of the fragmentation and shifts taking place in the MEC, is that the state-owned electricity sector, Eskom, is indebted, it's in crisis. There's significant load shedding, load shedding is when you have planned blackouts. So it's not when the whole grid goes down, but it's in order to stop system collapse on the grid, you plan for blackouts and you plan to cut the power in certain parts of the country. So Eskom is kind of really struggling to function on various levels. It's considered a serious economic liability. Its coal-fired power plants are suffering from a declining energy availability factor. There's been quite well-documented evidence of corruption and state capture and mismanagement. Various former chief executives have been arrested or had criminal charges levelled against them. It currently doesn't have a chief executive at the moment. There's also been criminal syndicates in the coal supply chain, which hasn't helped with regards to the load shedding and the quality of the coal. Eskom's extremely indebted at the moment. It's received a lot of public finance from government, from national development finance institutions, but also from international institutions such as the World Bank and other sources of climate finance. And it's in order to kind of try and survive, it's increased its electricity prices sixfold over the last decade. So Eskom, as a kind of central player in the MEC, is very definitely struggling. It's subject to crisis, and that crisis has precipitated quite a lot of changes. And just as an illustration of how load shedding has got so much worse over the last 5 years, this is a graph that shows how in 2018 it wasn't great, but in 2023 it was really bad. And there's different stages of load shedding. So stage 1, I think, is just a couple of hours in a row, whereas stage 6 is kind of more like half a day. And what this was put together by a journalist in I think just a couple of weeks ago, but what it shows is that on many days of the year, there has been load shedding at some point in some part of the country. So there's an increasingly unreliable electric grid, and this has huge social implications, but also huge economic ones as well. So the sector's definitely in transition. Is it going from coal past to a renewable future? Possibly, probably. The question is, how does that take place, and who will be the winners and who will be the users? So the era of cheap coal and cheap electricity is definitely over. And there's major technological, institutional and regulatory shifts taking place in the electricity sector. So in 2011, there was a program for large-scale, utility-scale renewable energy, so large-scale wind farms and large-scale solar PV plants that connect to the transmission grid. And that had some levels of success, but also quite a lot of political opposition as well. So it's a program that's done quite well, but has also had trips and stumbles along the way. Another institutional shift is the unbundling of Eskom, the liberalisation of the electricity sector into, first of all, setting up an independent transmissions operator, but also unbundling the generation sector. And you could say that one step towards that is this utility-scale renewable energy program that has introduced projects from independent power producers. Energy-intensive users in South Africa are now starting to procure their own power. They're trying to buy themselves out of the grid, so they're installing their own solar plants to bypass Eskom because it's become so unreliable. And following that, there's been regulations on the transport of power, so companies selling to power plants selling to specifically to companies and transporting their electricity across the grid. As I mentioned about the climate change ambitions, we'll see a 50% reduction in coal and an increase in renewable energy. But the decommissioning of coal-fired power plants will halve domestic coal demand. It is quite a dramatic transition that is envisaged, although there's been backtracking on this, and Russia's invasion of Ukraine has had some influence on that because there's now been an increased export demand for South Africa's coal. But what is noticeable is that electricity generation from new renewable projects is now cheaper than Eskom's average tariff, so the electricity that Eskom supplies from coal-fired power plants. And also, globally speaking, as well as nationally speaking, coal is just less acceptable to investors. There's this whole environmental, social, and governance agenda now that investors are all subscribing to. And one of well, at the moment at least, these things are all quite trend-based, but at the moment it's a shift away from coal that's seen as less desirable. It gives you a lower ESG score. But of course, the transition is never straightforward. There's a kind of assumption. You just need to introduce this policy, fix this financial thing, bring this technology in, and it will all be fine. But it's never like that, really. South Africa is a really good illustration of that. So there's been a lot of political resistance to coal decommissioning, and also political resistance to the liberalisation of Eskom, and quite a lot of that's come from political and economic incumbents, including the Department for Minerals and Energy itself. There's been trade unions as well, or some parts of some trade unions. It's never kind of as simple as that, but some trade unions or some bits of the trade unions have also been perceive both renewable energy and also renewable energy from independent power producers as a potential threat to livelihoods, to jobs, etc. And there's huge questions over the ownership of renewable energy, and I've done research on this in terms of who's introducing it, who's building it, where's the money coming from, who's bringing in the technology, and it is largely, at least at the large scale, the utility scale, it is mostly private companies and quite a lot of the international companies as well. And there's questions around how the socio-economic distribution, how will the benefits of this new renewable energy sector be distributed socio-economically? And equally, I mean, that question stands for the coal industry as well, because that's also been far from equitable. But there is a strong ideological resistance to new forms of renewable energy coming in. And in the meantime, those who can afford to buy themselves out of an increasingly unreliable and expensive centralized grid, so particularly large companies, energy-intensive users, corporates, wealthy individuals as well, they're buying themselves out by installing own generation, so for particularly solar PV plants. But those who can't afford to buy themselves out can't afford to buy themselves out. So they're stuck with an unreliable and increasingly expensive electricity grid. So that's a kind of new dynamic or a new division that's emerging, alongside municipalities who are responsible for electricity distribution, but they buy electricity from Eskom and then they add a markup and then they on-sell it to customers. And the gains they make, the economic gains they make from doing that, they then use to cross-subsidise other services like health or education or road maintenance, etc. But municipalities are losing out on that now because they're losing customers, because customers are installing their own self-generation. So there's lots of shifts taking place, and not all of them positive. And then another tension is actually quite technical. The transmission grid is struggling in terms of capacity to absorb what is termed as variable renewable energy. So obviously the sun doesn't shine all the time, the wind doesn't blow all the time. a grid that is based around constant baseload from coal isn't designed to cope with that, so it needs upgrading, it needs strengthening, it needs developing, and there's technical challenges to doing that. And also the regulatory framework, rather than kind of setting the terms of the transition, is in many cases running alongside or running behind it. People have been, or companies, individuals have been installing their own forms of power, and the regulator has been running to catch up rather than setting the original terms. So this brings me to my last section of the talk, and this is around a just energy transition. There's definitely an energy transition taking place. How that develops is, I think, still a little bit remains to be seen. But is this energy transition just? And also, how are we even defining a just transition or a just energy transition? And I raise that question because there's a lot of really competing, sort of increasingly nebulous interpretations of what a just transition should mean. And it's become a buzzword, it's become a discourse from government, business, labour, civil society. There's quite a lot of conflicting approaches to what it should mean, as well as it also being enshrined in quite a lot of national documents and policies, including, for instance, the Climate Change Bill and the nationally determined contribution. That South Africa has quite a lot of plans and policies, and the just transition is written into a lot of those. But what isn't clear, or certainly not to me based on the research I've done, is through which policies should it be operationalised? What's the time frame? What's the cost? How should the responsibilities be distributed? What does it mean for labour, for employment, for vulnerable communities affected by coal-fired power plants and coal mines, etc.? The kind of really, really considerable socioeconomic and environmental impacts of just living next to a coal plant. All of these things are kind of still a little bit up for grabs. And speaking of being up for grabs, there's a Just Energy Transition Partnership that was announced in 2021, and this is a kind of like emerging financial arrangement between South Africa and various European countries and also the US. More recently, also Denmark and the Netherlands. And initially, the agreement was for these countries to provide $8.5 billion, but to leverage much greater amounts from both public and private sources. And this would be a 5-year plan to run until 2027. And recently, just this year, those commitments have increased to 11.9 billion. But this is a leveraging amount of money. The idea is this is kind of leveraging money from EU donors that will then give the green light for other investors to come in. And there's been, I saved you the detail because it's really detailed and kind of tedious once you start to get into it. But the kind of latest developments is there's a Just Energy Transition Investment Plan, and it's got 3 main prongs to it. And the first one, and perhaps the most major one, is power sector diversification. So that would include, for instance, the unbundling of Eskom, further investment for renewable energy, the strengthening of the transmission grid. That's a really major part, actually, of what is referred to by South Africans as the JETP. Also included in the Just Energy Transition Investment Plan is electric vehicles, green hydrogen, but there has been probably more focus on the power sector than anything else. So far, what has mostly been provided has been concessional loans rather than grants. So money that obviously comes with interest that will need to be paid back with interest. Some of these loans, or a lot of these loans so far, because this is still in really early stages, some of these loans have been development policy loans agreed for electricity market reform. And one major one of those has been from the World Bank. And the challenge, as far as I can work out, is less about access to finance, but rather the ability to afford the finance. There's a lot of talk. This kind of reminds me of discussions, long-standing discussions around development finance and perhaps more recent discussions around climate finance. It's not just the money, but it's also the terms on which that money is being provided, the interest or the conditionalities. You know, what do you have to do to get this money? How do you have to, in order to kind of remain accountable to this money, what policies do you have to implement and what impacts might that have? So there's been quite a lot of concerns raised over the types of conditionalities that might come with this money, and also that given that South Africa is quite indebted and Eskom is hugely indebted, how this might add to existing debt. One thing in terms of thinking about financing the just transition and kind of developments that are taking place is in Mpumalanga, which I've highlighted here because it's the province where most of the coal plant, or many of the coal mines are, and many of the coal-fired power plants are based. And so it's probably the province that will be most affected by the shift away from coal, and where the coal industry has had quite an influence, or a huge influence, on the structure of the local economy, the nature of the labour market, transport, institutional systems, etc. So quite a high dependent on a single product that, if the climate change commitment kind of goes ahead, is going to be extremely affected. And this kind of discussion is not specific to South Africa necessarily, but how do you manage a transition where there's been a community or a region or a province that has been heavily dependent on one resource that is now well, it's in many ways has always been unsustainable for Mpumalanga. There's always been an incredibly detrimental impact on communities living within the vicinity of the coal mine. But there's an extreme economic dependence on this product. So some of the grant funds from the Just Energy Transition Plan are being channeled into that, but it's not quite clear how that's going. I mean, some of the research I've done is that there's quite a lot of mistrust from local communities around some of these plans. There's not necessarily buy-in from local government. And this quote I've included because I think it encapsulates quite well some of the feeling at the moment. So there's no belief that people will benefit. There's quite a tension between workers and communities, because there are people who are saying, no, we're losing jobs, but the communities are saying, no, we are losing lives. And so, meaning that the impact of living in the vicinity of a coal mine or a coal-fired power plant has all manner of health and social and environmental impacts. So that's a kind of another really key tension when it comes to thinking about any kind of just transition. So this brings me to some of the conclusions just from this research that is still quite ongoing, actually. But first of all, so there's an incumbent political class and economic interests that are still very organised around the coal sector and related coal sectors, and that incumbent class is still very influential. And it also has, not all of it, but there is also an interface with criminal activity in the coal supply chain. As I mentioned, there's been quite well-documented evidence surrounding corruption in coal supplies and the impact that's had on the quality of coal and subsequently the quality of the electricity supply. And at the same time, or taking place alongside this, there's an emerging new political class and new economic interests, or maybe a reconfiguration of the previous ones as well. And that's forming around a low carbon regime. And when I say that, a regime sounds kind of all neat and tidy and homogenous, and I don't think it is really. It's more like a kind of collection of networks. But this new low-carbon configuration, or whatever you want to call it, has new political and economic institutions forming around it. And that includes new forms of finance, but also new technological configurations as well that are interacting with that. And this is part of the liberalisation and decentralisation of the electricity sector, which is taking place in parallel with the increased financialisation of the economy, which comes back to what I mentioned earlier about from minerals energy complex to minerals energy finance complex. I'd also say that there's tensions between a just energy transition, or a just transition more generally, and energy security. So people who perhaps or the impacts of those who are able to pay for energy security to buy themselves out of an unreliable and increasingly expensive electricity grid. That's energy security, but is it a just energy transition, or maybe is it a just transition for all? Probably not. There's policy incoherence and competing in agendas, for sure. That's not unusual anywhere. But one of the things that I think is really important to highlight is the risks of a reactive, chaotic and unplanned transition. And this is written about by Nell et al. I've put some references at the end if anyone's interested. And one of the things they say is, or what they're essentially saying, is that decarbonisation through deindustrialisation alone is going to result in socioeconomic devastation and chaos. Unless a transition is carefully planned and carefully managed, it will have quite devastating socioeconomic consequences. If you're thinking about climate finance, one more minute. Okay, I'm going to skip over this. Perhaps I can come back to it in the discussion. But what I did want to end on was this, because as you're all post-growth, or many of you are post-growth scholars, and you spend a lot of time thinking about these things. So this was, so Mark Swilling, who works at the University of Stellenbosch in South Africa, he wrote a really nice summary that I came across the other day, where he summarised thinking about South Africa's just transition into 4 key interpretations. One is decarbonisation only. The second is decarbonisation and social mitigation. The third is decarbonisation, social mitigation, and upstream industrialisation. And the fourth one is you can't have a just transition without a post-capitalist transition. Discuss. That's me like throwing something into the floor for further discussions after we've heard the other two.